May all that you stand for and that we stand for be preserved under the providence of God for the happiness of mankind.
The trouble is caused by unthinking people who carelessly throw away ageless ideals as if they were old and outworn machinery.
That is the values, liberty before the law and the supremacy of people over the state, to which we can always with confidence return as a powerful and uniting force.
Australia is not a secular country. It is a free country.
Good evening and welcome to Pillow Talk. In this special live episode, I'm interviewing Mark Hornshaw. He's one of the candidates for the Liberal Democrats, but he's actually so much more. And in that more capacity, I'm interested in talking to him tonight. He's also one of the authors of the Liberal Democrats policy platform called their Freedom Manifesto, which is an exciting read of 10 different points. I'm going to get him back hopefully before the election to talk about the education policy, which he specifically wrote on. But in the capacity that he's going to be insightful and helpful to voter education tonight, it's his capacity as a university lecturer for first-year students in the field of economics. Now, economics is something that I love reading about. I'm an amateur student of and have read some of the great books and nowhere near enough, so I still need lots of help, like most voters. But I know enough to recognise when there's a policy that makes sense and a policy that doesn't. I know enough to know when a policy is asking for big government interventions, the kind that most conservatives and classical liberal and libertarian voters are opposed to. If you've been protesting mandates and lockdowns in the last 2 years, then you're a small government voter. You don't want big government. Like me, you think government is the pandemic, and viruses are a natural part of their ecosystem, but they should be kept under control and as manageable and small as possible. That's the real pandemic we need the cure for. That's never been more aptly demonstrated than in the last few years, where government's been getting out of control and their policies have been killing tens of thousands of people, if not millions of people around the world. And that's not hyperbole. That's very demonstrated. Studies have been showing that. One of my favorite guests, maybe a year ago now, and I'm sorry I can't remember his name right now, but I think his name's Simon. But he is a professor of economics again in Canada, and he basically observed that lockdown policy is the worst public policy failure of Canada and obviously of the Western world and people who had very similar policies. Lockdown is the worst policy failure in peacetime in Canadian history. Now, he also helped me understand that economics isn't just the study of economies, but it's actually the study of models of predictive behavior and aligning those predictions and models to observable reality. And we knew beyond any shadow of a doubt by September 2000, certainly people like me said, hey, first principles, this was never okay from the beginning. And then 3 months later, there was strong evidence to suggest that the government overreacted. But after 6 months, there was more than enough empirical data and hard evidence that lockdown policy was the worst policy failure of all time. Big government is a huge, huge problem. And so we need to be smarter as voters to figure out exactly when we can find those big government clues in the policies that are being announced and promoted. Because I tell you, even some of the right-wing, pro-freedom, freedom-friendly minor parties that are asking for our vote this year have some big government policies amongst their anti-mandate policies. And anti-mandate's a great start. But if you truly want freedom from government, then you need the smallest government possible. Another metaphor I use to illustrate that I don't hate government. I'm not an anarchist, but I am a small government Christian. As a Christian, that's my political identity. Whatever else I am is coincidental, but I choose to be Christian. And the small government aspects of that is that God designed boundaries for government, proper places and functions for it. And another metaphor that I use to demonstrate that is a blackberry bush. When I grew up in country farming areas of New South Wales, blackberry bushes were something that we used to do on a family day trip on the weekend. We'd go to a farm, we'd pick blackberries, we'd go to the dam and catch some yabbies and have blackberries and yabbies by the dam for lunch. It was a wonderful day out. But blackberries are a huge problem for farmers. They're essentially a noxious weed that just grows and grows and grows and expands in size, and they're thorny and the cattle can't eat them, and they're prickly, and they're a great place for rabbits and foxes to hide. And they're really not at all conducive to farming the land and making the land productive and enjoyable. It's blackberries or nothing when there's a blackberry bush in your paddock. And so Australians have really taken a concerted effort over the recent decades since I was a kid to eliminate and get blackberries under control. Exactly how government should be done. There is good fruit to be gained from government, but they need to be kept small, contained, under control. Otherwise, they become thorny, overgrow, and crowd out any other productive, useful space for human existence. It's a powerful metaphor if you think about it. Well, let me introduce Mark Hornshaw, who basically explained to me that he has to get the students who come to him in their first year of university and undo the damage of things they might have learned in high school, which is, I guess, something we should be grateful for if he gets the chance to educate them properly. Mark, welcome to Pello Talk this evening.
Thanks so much, Dave. It's great to be on. Just a couple of comments on your intro there. Yeah, the people who mandated us and who had terrible policies on COVID are the same people who've run up the debt and who've messed up the economy. If we don't trust them in one area, we shouldn't trust them in the other, exactly as you're saying. Also, I'll just say a lot of Christians and conservatives tend to focus on social issues, and I can understand why, the culture war sort of issues. And those are obviously of great concern to Christians. Economics can be kind of a little bit too difficult, and we'll just put that aside and we'll just say, oh, that's too hard to understand, and we'll let someone else deal with the economics, but I'll focus on the social issues.
Yep.
But if we don't understand and focus on economics, those other issues are just going to be so much worse, because if you're under financial pressure, then you're even more at the mercy of the social engineers. And, financial pressures is the number one reason why couples break up.
Right.
And so it is important to have, a strong economy. And so it is important to understand the danger that we face from people who want to mess up the economy.
That's right. I think to that end, government has become an idol. Government, statism, I've said a lot over the last 2 years, statism is idolatry. The replacing of God's authorities and the things that God ordained, self-government, church government, family government, replacing those things with statism, with big government, is idolatrous, because it's putting your preferred order of things above what God ordained. Government has no authority to tell a parent the values that they should be indoctrinating their children with, pastoring, discipling their children with. That's the parents' realm of authority. Government has no right to be telling churches when they should and should not open their doors for the preaching of the gospel, communion, fellowship, corporate worship, the ministry of the body to each other. That's exactly what civilization needed over the last 2 years, was hope and a place of relief and social support and structures. But when we have people who are generational welfare recipients, people who are disempowered and entirely dependent on government, that's when the government is able to bribe voters with something commonly called pork barreling, which Proverbs very clearly speaks against as a corruption to a nation. When people are entirely dependent on the government, they literally take their eyes off God. They literally lose all sense of personal responsibility, and government can be corrupted and lead us down paths of injustice and other kinds of these social perversion of these social issues that we're talking about. because they get a blank check for power based on their willingness to line people's pockets. We need to understand the economic drivers, because this isn't just about economies and big level intellectual thinking. It's actually about the motivation of human behavior every 3 years at election time. And if we are not empowered to see through their confusion and their marketing and their spin and their deceptions, then we're going to be taken captive by these hollow philosophies that they pump out. Let's talk about, I guess, the big headline tonight that I want to keep coming back to. And you might want to start with some quotes or bring them in later. But the concept is that inflation is theft.
It's a great quote. And yeah, let me read out a quote from John Maynard Keynes saying exactly that. It's quite a long quote, bear with me. He says, Lenin is said to have declared that the best way to destroy the capitalist system is to debauch the currency. By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate, there's your theft, secretly and unobserved, an important part of the wealth of their citizens. By this method, they not only confiscate, but they confiscate arbitrarily. And while the process impoverishes many, it actually enriches some. Just think of those people who, their house prices just doubled.
Mm-hmm.
The sight of this arbitrary rearrangement of riches strikes not only at security, but at confidence in the equity of the existing distribution of wealth. Those to whom the system brings windfalls beyond their deserts, and even beyond their expectations or desires, become profiteers, who are the object of the hatred of the bourgeoisie, whom the inflationism has impoverished, not less than that of the proletariat. As the inflation proceeds, and the real value of the currency fluctuates wildly from month to month, all permanent relations between debtors and creditors, which form the ultimate foundation of capitalism, become so utterly disordered as to be almost meaningless, and the process of wealth-getting degenerates into a gamble and a lottery. Lenin was certainly right, says Keynes. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all of the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. Now, wow. Keynes wrote that in 1922. Keynes's general theory on employment and money and interest came out in 1936, but Keynes basically then spent his career advocating for that very inflationism that he'd already said 14 years earlier was just to destroy the capitalist system. Keynes was quite a hateful person. Keynes praised the Nazis. Keynes was someone who, people might not know this, but it's there, used to brag about going to Tunisia where he could get room and boy. That's what he used to pay for in Tunisia. You can figure out what that is.
Room and boy?
Room and boy, yeah. In other words, he's a pedophile.
He's a pedophile.
Wow,
I didn't know that.
Keynes's system has been put into practice in basically all governments around the world over the last 100 years. And it's a process of doing that very thing, inflationism, so that some people get rich, other people feel that they're unfairly treated. It brings hatred, it brings class division, and ultimately destroys the capitalist system. He was one of those Fabian socialists who wanted to, didn't want the sort of revolutionary communism, but wanted to bring it in more slowly, So we're stuck with a Keynesian system where, let me just talk, before we talk about more about inflation, about what an interest rate is. Because I think this is another thing that people are confused on. We're sort of come to learn that interest is just some annoying thing that banks charge you because they're just mean. And wouldn't it be good if they just didn't? Right?
Yeah.
If we could just borrow money for free, that would be great.
So it's the price on your credit card or your home loan or your personal car loan.
Yeah, but it just seems like a price that you pay for nothing.
And it can vary. Your credit card might be 20% and your home loan might be 3% and your personal loan might be somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. But interest is an actual price. That's what we need to understand. That a price of anything is a signal. If the price of something is high, more people will want to sell it. If the price of something is low, more people will want to buy it. A price communicates something about scarcity, and tells people what to do more of and what to do less of. Inflation's also a price, but it's the price of waiting or of not having to wait. It's the mutually agreed price between someone who borrows and someone who lends. Someone who wants to bring forward their purchases, so they need to borrow, or someone who is prepared to wait, and so they will lend. And they mutually agree on a value for that. So if I offered you $100 now, or 90 in 1 year's time, you might say, okay, well, I'll take the 90 in 1 year's time. That means we've agreed on a 10% interest rate between us, say. So there's a reason that there's this natural rate of interest.
Mm-hmm.
If interest was just zero, well, everybody would just want to borrow and no one would want to save, right? That would be impossible in a free market. That would mean we place for interest to be zero naturally all on its own without interference would be pretty much impossible. It means I'll give you 100 now, or I'll give it to you in 1,000 years. Do you mind which one? And you say, no, either way, same to me. Well, that's not a realistic situation, right? For interest to be zero. There's always going to be some price of waiting or not having to wait. In a society where people were, let's say, very patient, very future-oriented, they're willing to wait because they'd rather have more in the future. They'd rather leave an inheritance to their kids, or they'd rather have a better retirement. So if everybody in society, or most people, were very patient like that, lots of people would be savers. And interest rates would be naturally low because the supply of savings would be high in that sort of society. If you imagine a different sort of society where, say, everybody is a drug addict, or lots of people are, or lots of people are very much have to have their fix right now, well, who's saving in that society? Not many people. They all want to borrow. And so interest rates in that society would be very high because loanable funds would be quite scarce. And so an interest rate tells you something. An interest rate then tells producers what to do. So in a society where people are saving, like the first one, there'd be plenty of saved funds available to start long lines of business that take time. Like interest, when you're a business, certain kinds of business are more reliant on borrowing for a long production period, like, say, building an apartment building, or building a new bridge or road, or a new factory. Things or mining, things that are sort of high up in production take a long time, and so interest is a big part of the cost. But in that first society, those things would be profitable. They'd be affordable because there is savings. Because people are willing to wait, then those long production processes will pay off one day. But in the other kind of society where everybody is very impatient, where interest rates are high, what sort of business would you start there? You'd have to start a business that caters to people's immediate needs. You couldn't start a business that has a long payoff because it'd just be not profitable.
Yeah.
And so the business person is forced to cater to how people are, either long processes that take time or very immediate consumer goods.
An example of that that I know from TV, where I get some of my education, is when you see these renovating shows and they're doing a fixer-upper and flipping a house and they're renovating it. They've borrowed a sum of money from the bank to do it. And then all of a sudden there's an unpredicted delay, unforeseen delay. It might be the local council or county has held up permits and won't let them proceed with the plumbing work until such and such is sorted out. And then they have to wait 2 weeks. And because they've got $100,000 or $200,000 or $500,000 on loan at an interest rate, which is costing them money every day, the cost of that delay is literally 2 weeks of that interest rate, which might put up their budget by $5,000 or $10,000, so some amount that they're very uncomfortable with. And so that's the principle that you're talking about in place that I can see, where they need to get this done quickly because the cost of the debt is too high, the cost of the interest.
Exactly. Now, central banks step in. Central banks, like the Reserve Bank of Australia, when they say we're lowering interest rates, what do they mean? When the central bank says we're going to lower the cash rate, it's just been raised slightly, but it's still at a record low. It was at 0.1%. What are they literally doing? Well, they're creating more money. They're inflating. They're pushing out more and more money because the interest rate that we naturally agree on between borrowers and lenders is not going to be anywhere near 0.1%, right? There'd be no savers at that level.
Right.
So for it to be artificially pushed down to that level, they've got to just create more and more money so that anyone who wants to borrow can be satisfied, not through other people having saved, but just through the RBA creating more money and the whole banking system. And this is the situation that we have, where interest, instead of being a natural price that's agreed on between borrowers and lenders, it's an artificial price where the borrowing is just satisfied. And so you borrow $2 million for a new home. Who saved $2 million? Nobody. But the RBA just created that money and put it into the banking system.
How feel free to bookmark this question if you want to come back to it later, but how does the RBA create money out of thin air?
All right, let's come back to that question.
Okay.
So, well, they just write it onto their books. They just literally put it into the banking system. And the banks then pyramid their own monetary expansion because of fractional reserve banking, but we won't get too technical here. But they put it into the banking system. So inflation helps those who are connected with the banking system. Let's circle back to that. Let me just stay on my point about interest rates.
You just said inflation when you're talking about the Reserve Bank, the central bank, adding money onto the books because they felt like it was necessary. That's the same thing then? Inflation, printing more money?
The traditional definition of inflation is the expansion of the money supply. Let's come back to the definition of inflation too. But the traditional definition is inflating, expanding the money supply. And so the Reserve Bank does that every time they're holding interest rates below their market level. Now, the trouble is what that does. When you have, instead of, when I'm comparing those two societies, one with a naturally high interest rate and one with a naturally low interest rate, either way, producers must serve the needs of consumers. If interest rates are low, naturally, resources are freed up from consumer goods industries because people aren't going to the shops. They're not going to restaurants. They're patient. They're waiting. They're saving for their retirement. And so resources would be freed up to go into investment industries, into production of machines and buildings and construction and things. But in a society where people are very now-oriented, well, the business resources would have to move into retail and things like that. But either way, the resources move to where customer demand is. But when you have this artificial situation, the people building apartment buildings and mining equipment and things and the long-term needs, they see this, they get access to cheap funds to borrow. And so they're drawing on more of society's resources. But consumers are still going to the shops and buying new TVs and going to restaurants. They're still living it up because they haven't saved. They're still spending. And so the resources are just now being stretched in two directions. They're going to the investment industries, like the capital goods industries, I should say, and the consumer goods industries at the same time. But there aren't twice as many resources. It's just an illusion. The resources that we have are just being stretched in too many ways, and there's going to be a payback.
Yep.
There's going to be a consequence. The consequence is the recession.
Can we define what you mean by resources? Are we talking about currency or
no, physical things? Like when you see the price of timber has gone up, and that people can't finish their housing projects because there's not enough physical resources. There's not enough plumbers. There's not enough timber. There's just not enough physical resources. it looked like all of these things were going to be profitable during the boom, when we were under this illusion that there were more resources than there were. In the bust, we realized we were fooled, right? We were fooled by low interest rates during the boom. We've been in this cycle of this boom cycle for, like, you could say, depending on how you measure it, 14 years,
Right.
where we're now seeing that we were duped, that we couldn't all afford $2 million houses, that we couldn't start all of these new apartment buildings. There's a book called The Skyscraper Curse, that every time that there's a record-breaking skyscraper built, the project is started during a boom and finished during a recession, right? Every single one, going back to the 1800s.
Wow.
Yeah, the book's called The Skyscraper Curse. Very interesting. And so this artificial boom is caused by artificially low interest rates, but everybody thinks it's fun during the boom. Everybody thinks they're flipping houses, and they think, this is great. I'm going to get more renovations on my house. I'm going to get a new TV. And the government even tells people, we need to get spending up. Go and spend. This is our way out of this fix. Go and spend more. And so it's fun during the boom because we're being tricked. The recession that follows is not fun, but it's reality. Another metaphor, this is used by an economist called Mises, Ludwig von Mises. He said, imagine a builder, and this builder is like a metaphor for the whole economy. But the builder has 10,000 bricks, but he thinks he has 20,000 bricks. With 10,000 bricks, he could build a house in a certain configuration with 10,000 bricks, but instead he starts laying out the bricks in a much wider footprint that would need 20,000 bricks to finish, because he's under this delusion somehow. Now, as he starts laying out the bricks, the more he continues on this way, the more he's going to waste when he finally realizes what's going on. If you see that the builder has already laid out 100 bricks in this wrong configuration, you could stop him and say, look, come to reality. You don't have 20,000 bricks, you've only got 10,000. You've wasted 100 of them now, so you've only got 9,900, but you could still build a decent house with that. If you thought, no, the way I'm going to help this builder is by keeping him under the delusion. I'm going to keep putting more mirrors around his piles of bricks, so to keep him thinking, because the way to help the economy is just to get builders to build anything. This is Keynesian economics, the broken window fallacy. Just spend money on anything at all. It doesn't matter what it is. And so just trick this builder into continuing on his merry way. Well, if he lays his last brick in this wrong configuration, he's going to have to destroy the lot and be left with nothing. Can you see, the longer he persists in his delusion, the more he's going to waste. And so the best thing to do is to not inflate the boom. But if the boom is being inflated, the best thing to do is to stop it as soon as possible, rather than continue it on. The sooner you stop the boom, the less bad the recession that follows will be. But the longer the boom goes on, the worse the recession will be. So another little quote on that from Hayek: to combat the depression by a forced credit expansion is to attempt to cure the evil by the very means which brought it about. So we see, some people saying, what we need now that we've had this boom, this housing boom, and that if interest rates rise, it might hurt some people and they might find it harder to pay the interest. So let's just have a policy that takes political control of the RBA and forces home loan rates down to 3% for the next 5 years. That's a policy of one of the parties, right? The trouble is, it's going to make it worse. It means you're just going to try to keep the delusion going, keep inflating. To hold interest rates down to 3% means you have to just inflate, print even more money. If you print even more money, you're going to inflate the value of those houses even more. And then after 5 years, you're going to have an even bigger crash.
That's what
an even bigger crash is worse.
That's what occurs to me, is that if we interfere in the price of mortgages, then it's only a delay of the inevitable. And so whatever the price should have been, when the 5-year gap catches up to it, the amount of correction at that stage will be a much bigger step up than is currently needed, which people may have the time to adjust to. Because I used to be a finance broker, and one of the many lives ago, one of the things I understood, just statistically, is that whether my clients were on 50 or 100 or 150 or $200,000 a year household income, because I also helped them with their budgeting. Everybody, and this wasn't just my clients, but across Australia, the average was that Australians spent 103% of their annual income, whether they were on a big, average, or low income. We just always figure out how to spend all of what we have and a little bit more. And then when we have a big pay cut for whatever reason, we actually learn how to adapt our lifestyle and still spend just a little bit more than we earned through, I guess, credit. But I guess the moral I learned from that is we're all happy and all able to adapt to the incomes we're on when we have to discipline ourselves through a lack of choice and a lack of options. And so I think people will be better able to adapt to the changes they have to make if it's incremental over the next 5 years rather than all of a sudden at the end of 5 years.
Yeah. So the RBA wants to, and they've said that, we need to lift interest rates, and everyone says that's just because you're mean, right? The RBA is just being mean to us and making us pay more. If the RBA doesn't raise interest rates, they have to just allow hyperinflation. You have one or the other. Neither of them's fun. Just my last little quote, I know I've given you a few, but from Mises again. The boom cannot continue indefinitely. There are two alternatives. Either the banks continue the credit expansion without restriction and thus cause constantly mounting price increases and an ever-growing orgy of speculation, which, as in all other cases of unlimited inflation, ends in a crack-up boom and the collapse of the money and credit system. In other words, a Venezuela situation, a hyperinflation, or the banks stop before this point is reached, voluntarily renounce further credit expansion, and thus bring about the crisis. The depression follows in both instances. It's not like one gives you a free lunch. You can have they can raise interest rates and there'll be a recession, or they can not raise interest rates, there'll be hyperinflation and still a recession.
Yep.
There's got to be...
Are there any examples in history where these kind of things have happened side by side, where same context, same period of time, governments interfered and there was a bad results, government kept their hands off, and there was bad but not as bad results?
Good question. Yes, the forgotten depression of 1920 to 21 was actually deeper than the Great Depression. It was a massive drop that inflated during World War One. The government had used inflation to finance the war, and there needed to be a payback. There needed to be, but it was a deep recession in 1920, but it was over in less than a year. So we never refer to the Great Depression of 1920. It was over so quickly, but governments didn't, basically they didn't come up with any of the kind of interventions that they did during the Great Depression of the 1930s. They actually cut government spending. They actually, instead of increasing it, they just cut it.
Kesho says, doesn't everything the government do make things worse?
Yes.
I think, Kesho, that's generally true. And that's why you want to examine Freedom Party policies that have less government intervention involved.
Yeah. So then you get to the Great Depression that was kicked off in 1929, but this time the government so-called threw everything at it, right? In America, that is. In Australia, not so bad. Joseph Lyons was a kind of a did the opposite and was pretty good in Australia. But in America, we had Roosevelt and Hoover, who both of them wanted to try out all of their new interventions, all of their new tricks, all of their wage controls and price controls and stimulus packages and government programs and public works. And what happened? The Great Depression went on for basically a decade and a half. And everything they did made it worse.
Yep.
And there was a depression within the depression in 1933.
I think I recall Thomas Sowell saying about the Great Depression, the late 20s and early 30s, that it had already started to fix itself before the government decided to intervene, and they made everything 10 times worse and 10 times as long as it was going to be at the end of that decade.
Exactly. And they only had to look back to 1920 to see where the government had cut spending. And so this is bring us back to the current day. The government has run up, closing towards $1 trillion of debt, with basically nothing to show for it. I mean, during COVID, did they build any new hospitals, or did they, that they weren't already going to build?
Exactly right. The amount of billions of dollars they spent on keeping people home from work, they could have built 10 gold-plated hospitals around Australia, an actual solution to a pandemic, instead of paying people to stay home and do nothing and get depressed and fat.
But when the government is in so much debt, this is another reason why the RBA will be tentative about raising interest rates, because the government's the biggest debtor. The government can't afford it either. They don't only spend 103% of their income. They're even worse than kind of the worst of us. And so they're in so much debt that if interest rates rise, the government will find it hard to pay the interest. And one of the biggest line items of the budget will just be interest on the government debt. And so basically, while the government gets something for nothing, it seems, by deficit spending, the rest of us get nothing for something, right? It's not like the government would like to say, you'll be looked after, everyone will get free stuff, the consequence won't fall onto anybody, but of course those are lies. We're seeing the consequences now in the form of higher prices. I left a little point that I noted down. What is the definition of inflation? It used to mean the expansion of the money supply. Now there's no word for the expansion of the money supply. Inflation has come to mean a statistical measure, the consumer price index. Whatever that goes up by, that's the inflation rate. That's just one of the consequences of inflation. But now the word has been sort of manipulated to mean only that one consequence. So in 2020, in 12 months, the money supply was increased by 27.5%. Just wrap your head around that. That's how much inflation there was, you could say, in 2020.
In the last how long?
In 1 year, in the year 2020, there's been even more since then, but just in that 1 year, 2020, there was a 27.5% increase in the M1 money supply, while the consumer price index that's measured and reported.
And the M1 money supply is all the money available in all the bank accounts in all of Australia.
Yes, all our bank accounts. That was increased by 27.5%. Of course, that didn't go to the poor. It went mostly to people that already owned assets. Like Keynes was saying, some get rich unfairly, right?
Yeah.
But and to government spending, people close to government. But the measured inflation rate was 1.4%. And so the RBA is able to say there's no inflation going on. That's what they were saying in 2020. They were saying, we're going to keep
the money supply increased by a quarter, 27.5%, and yet the RBA said inflation only increased by a handful of percents.
1.4%.
1.4%. And that's because that's the price of that's CPI. Are they confusing CPI with inflation?
Well, they've come to CPI is now what inflation has come to mean.
Wow.
Just CPI. But the CPI that year hadn't increased yet. because they're only considering some goods. House prices aren't included in CPI. So house prices can go up 20% and it doesn't affect it.
And rent.
Yeah, and rent. Well, rent is included, but CPI is just a statistic, and it's not a very good one. And so now we're seeing CPI rise. Right now we're seeing just the price of petrol and the price of food and the price of ordinary consumer goods rising.
Wow.
But the inflation has already happened. Now we're just seeing it played out in consumer prices. But if you remember back to 2020, the RBA was saying we've got to get inflation up. It's too low.
Yep.
And we're going to have to keep interest rates at their low level until at least 2024. They were actually saying that back then. And now
let's just take a breath at this just thought. I want to just let everybody know I'm talking with Mark Hornshaw. He's a candidate for the Liberal Democrats, but more importantly, he's an economics lecturer. And what we're doing tonight is just providing a bit of voter education around the concepts of economics, the basic concepts that we need to understand so we can peer behind the curtains and decode the policies that we're being spoon-fed in slogans, because it's a lot more complicated and a lot more nuanced than that. And you need to understand when what the parties are proposing is actually worse than what we've got it now, making government bigger and not actually solving the problem or giving us more of what caused the problem. And so that's no solution at all. If you have any questions, this is a topic I don't want to go faster than the audience on. And if we need to do it over 27 videos, then so be it. Or if we just tackle what we can do tonight and not bite off more than we can chew, please ask your questions. Don't be afraid. There's probably 200 people thinking the same thing as you. Be the first to ask so we can deal with it. I'll ask Mark. We'll put it on the screen. We'll get it there. Any other comments or questions you've got as well, they are welcome. So we're not going to do personal financial advice tonight as much as we would like to about where the best place is to put your money, etc. We're just trying to get a grasp on economic definitions and understanding so that we don't end up like Venezuela. If you'd like to be a supporter, help us fight inflation and donate $10, $20 per month. That would be a big help. Head to goodsource.news/support or click on the support button when you get to the website, goodsource.news, and that'll help us to bring you more programs like this. Now, Mark, I actually have forgotten the exact topic that we were on, but do you have it in your head what you're about to say next?
Yeah, well, the people who like to inflate will always find an excuse to do so, right?
Right.
They will inflate to the maximum of their ability because they can hand that money to their cronies and they can pay for government programs. And then when we see the consequences, like we're seeing now we're finally seeing consumer prices rising very steeply. We find that in 2021, and we only find out after the year's finished, but we find that they've been rising much faster than the RBA was saying. Then they say, oh, this inflation just came from somewhere. We don't know where. Maybe it's just because businesses are just getting greedy and putting up their prices, or maybe it's because of Putin. Or there's always excuses for why there's a rise in CPI, but it's never blamed on the actual cause, which was the inflation that was going on already.
The inflation of the monetary supply, do you mean?
Yeah, inflation of money supply, which there's now no word for anymore.
Yep.
And that's used to push down interest rates. When you push down interest rates, everybody is stretching the resources in too many directions. And when they're stretched in too many directions, there's a reckoning to pay.
Yep.
So now we're getting nothing for something. Now the theft has already gone on. The government's already stolen from you through inflation. And now you're just realizing that your house was robbed. Yep. When you see the actual price rises in the shops, and so you realize that your pay packet doesn't go as far as you thought it did, that's like coming home after your house has been burgled and seeing the damage that's already done. So I suppose a topic that we need to cover is what can be done about it.
Let me ask you a question to lead into that that area. Judah asks, could mining tax on exports cover a fixed 3% interest rate?
It's another silly policy, in my opinion. The party that's calling for a new mining tax says that it'll be used to pay off the debt. So it can't be used to pay off the debt and to make university free and to make houses have low interest rates and so on. It can't be used in all these directions. The other thing with a mining tax, if mining companies could charge 15% more, they already would. So Clive Palmer is out saying China will pay that, Asia will pay. We'll put a 15% tax on iron ore. I know about this because I'm a miner, that the customer will pay. Well, he would know, because he's in business, that if you could charge the customer 15% more, you already would, right? And you wouldn't wait for the government to do it through a tax. Every business person knows that you can put your price up, but you'll get less sales, right?
Yep.
And so
my understanding is the price of our uranium, etc., iron ore, that he's wanting to put a levy on, a fundraising levy on, is already the same price as other mining nations which supply the Asian, China markets, and so our prices would just be more expensive than those nations.
Yes, but still, we would still sell some because it would be needed. The world price would rise a bit, but less would be bought, and so there's no free lunch that way. But I don't think that is the policy, to use that to make house prices cheap. The policy was to use that to pay off debt, I believe.
$1 trillion debt, yeah.
Yeah, we're making house prices cheap is done by taking political control. So not house prices, home loan interest rates,
mortgage rates. Yep.
Is done by taking political control of the RBA. Instead of the RBA being this sort of, supposedly neutral body of experts, having the politicians in charge. Now, I don't like having these so-called neutral experts in charge either. I don't think that they're particularly good people. But having politicians in charge, theoretically, you think, we could vote them out. That's more democratic. It's more like putting the people in charge. But people always vote for free stuff, right? And so politicians always win elections by promising more free stuff.
Yeah. And democracy is two lions and a goat voting on who's for dinner.
Yes. And so when politicians do take political control of central banks, they always invariably make it even more reckless. And this was the situation we had in the 1970s, where the RBA was kind of, leaned on by politicians for political gain to make it easy for governments to borrow.
Yep.
And we had 10% inflation year on year in the 70s.
Yep.
And then we had a huge reckoning with a huge recession, and we had stagflation. It doesn't end well when you take political control of the RBA. But
so we've been there, we've tried that, and it was terrible.
It was terrible. And so it was the reforms of in that era of Hawke, Keating, Thatcher, and Reagan that sort of these reforms that sort of ended a lot of those price controls and things that were causing so much damage. But where politicians have just gone, let's just go for it and put our foot flat to the accelerator, that's when you get Venezuela or Zimbabwe and hyperinflation.
Chris Hewitt says, according to Gina, assuming Gina Reinhardt, we will be the Greece of the South. Now, what's that? I don't know why I have trouble with this word all the time, but what's that word that talks about economic restraint, reining spending back aggressively? Austerity. That's what I think that's my personal opinion. I think austerity is the solution to the last 2 years, to all the the drunken spending and borrowing and debt accumulation that generations of future Australians have been robbed of in advance without their permission, they're going to have to be paying back our spending over the last 2 years. And instead of the government inflating the currency and continuing to print more money, we should just be tightening our belt a heck of a lot and learning to do without, instead of thinking about all the extra ways the government can save us.
Yeah. Well, it's a lie when the government
Greeks didn't like austerity.
The Greeks never really got actual austerity. What was called austerity in Greece was just we'll keep deficit spending, but just not quite as much as we won't increase it by as much as we promised we would, but we'll still increase. Wow. That's called austerity. But real austerity means actually cutting the size of government.
Yep.
And John Howard cut government, all government departments by 10%, except for defence, in the late 90s.
Really?
And, yeah, we didn't have a recession.
Wow.
He cut the budgets of his government departments. But
did anybody die of starvation?
No one died of starvation. In fact, the economy boomed. But when the governments say everybody will get a bailout, no one will miss out, they're lying. Somebody's going to miss out. Now, who should do the most belt tightening? The perpetrators of all of this economic damage or the victims? I think the perpetrators. I think Canberra should bear the biggest brunt of any tightening, of any belt tightening that needs to happen. Sorry, what's that?
What does that look like? Canberra tightening its belt. How does that not just reduce government services to taxpayers and the general public?
Well, we want to put more in the hands of the actual honest people, the honest and productive people. We want Canberra to take less of what you earn, and so that you've got more to spend on what's important to you.
You're talking about Liberal Democrat policy being to reduce government spending overall and rein that in.
It needs to be reined in. They can't keep adding, otherwise they're going to keep adding to the debt. It's not just, the government doesn't only have $1 trillion deficit, they've got, $1 trillion debt, but they've got an ongoing year-on-year deficit as well that's just adding and growing that debt every single year because they can't live within their means.
Yep.
What needs to happen urgently is for the government just to balance its budget. Do you remember back like 2010 and even leading up to the 2013 election, everybody was saying, we're the ones that will balance the budget. You can't trust the other party.
Wayne Swan's
colours nailed to the mast.
Yeah, Wayne Swan's elusive surplus, always promised, never delivered.
But then Joe Hockey was the same. He said, we will deliver a surplus in our first year of office and every year after that. But the Liberal Party has also failed to ever deliver a surplus.
The debt has just ballooned on them both. This has been the case since 2010. It's just been going up and up and up.
But that urgently needs to happen, that the government just stops adding to the debt. It might take 10 or 20 years to pay it off. But as long as they just stop adding to it by cutting the government waste. And it doesn't mean that pensioners have to pay, or that we like usually when you say to a government department, how can you what can be saved, what can be cut here? Of course, they're always going to pick on the most important thing to voters, right? If you ask the Defence Department, is there any waste that we could cut? They could say, yeah, we'll just abolish the Navy.
Yep.
You know what I mean? And if you ask the government, is there anything that we could cut? Let's just let old people. Let's just cut. Let's just let old people have nothing.
The old age pension.
The old age pension, that can go. I mean, just to scare people, right? That people will just pick on the most sensitive thing, right?
Yep.
But look, Canberra is the richest city in Australia. The house prices there are the highest of any. The median salary is the highest of anywhere.
Rent is crazy.
But they can afford it, right? Because they're all working for the government. They're all on the gravy train.
What civil servants get is more than the Prime Minister, and it's just ridiculous. I mean, some civil servants, obviously not the lower rungs on the ladder. Let's go to a couple of comments. Suad says, when a nation's values are reduced to just economic ones, like in Australia, it ceases to become a nation. Yeah, well, we're talking about economics tonight, but it's certainly not the only values. But as social conservatives, sometimes the only thing we talk about is social values. And unlike the economic conservatives, who are only concerned about economics and end up being progressives in the Liberal Party, we need to be concerned about both responsible economic management, eliminating wasteful spending and inefficiencies, and we also need to be worried about justice, righteousness, morality and liberty in the nation as well. Suan Dean says, the mining giants pay minimal tax in Australia due to their offshore lending / borrowing from their overseas branches, view offshore tax havens. Likewise, huge companies like Amazon, Facebook, Apple, etc. pay zero GST and minimal, if any, income tax on profits due to their overseas infrastructure. If all overseas companies who operated in Australia paid GST and the correct rates of tax, how much better off would we be? How is it still possible that these overseas giants still rip blinds out? And ... So the comment might have been a lot longer and just didn't fit on the program tonight. Mark Hornshaw, I was talking with Topher Field just a few hours ago, and just asked him, what kind of things are you hearing from your comments and content that you see on the internet, which amounts to economic misinformation. And he said one of the things he's had to explain a lot recently is this concept of tax the companies properly. And Liberal Democrat policy is to reduce the company tax rate, and people are worried that means companies are going to be paying less tax. Is that the case? And if not, how does that actually work, that reducing the tax rate doesn't necessarily reduce revenue?
Yeah, great question. And just on that Facebook comment from before, every government says, like an easy target is to say these multi-billion-dollar tax dodgers, this is kind of a common refrain. Don't worry, we don't need to tax you. We'll just tax those multinational tax dodgers. And
right.
But it never actually amounts to anything, right? There isn't actually any ways that they can tax foreign companies any more than they're currently doing. And so this is just a talking point that just goes on and on and on forever. It's not like the Liberal Party or the Labor Party didn't try, all right?
Yep.
But what the Liberal Democrats' policy is a 20% flat tax, so a $40,000 tax-free threshold for earnings, and then a 20% flat tax after that, easy accounting, and 20% company tax, but only on profits that are taken either overseas or in Australia, that are taken home as earnings, and no tax on reinvested profits. So profits that are used to expand the business and employ more people, we want companies to do that. And this is an area where it will help small businesses more than large, because a large business, let's say Woolworths, if they want to build a new shopping centre, they can easily just borrow $100 million because everybody knows Woolworths. Everybody knows they're profitable. They can just float bonds and they can easily borrow money. But a small business, if you've ever been in business, you know it's so hard just to get an overdraft. It's so hard to get a small business loan, and you pay a high interest rate if you do. So a small business needs to grow through reinvesting profits, but they've already been taxed at 30% or 28 or close to it. Yep. If your profits have already been taxed, you can only put then 70% of it into growing the business.
Yep.
So we want no tax on reinvested profits. And then when that expansion becomes profitable, it'll still be taxed, because those profits will then be taken. Ultimately, the owner will want to take home some profits, right? Yep. And when they do, then it will be taxed at 20% along with their other income. Yep. But no tax on reinvested profits. Now, what will that do for Australia? Well, we'll be the tax haven. It'll be the Irish government complaining that Amazon and Google and things aren't paying enough tax over there because they're coming to Australia instead.
Yep.
We'd rather be the one. At the moment, we have one of the highest company tax rates in the OECD. So one of the highest of sort of wealthy or Western countries. And so, of course, companies would rather report their profits somewhere else than here, so that they can avoid our punitively high tax rates. But if our tax rate was lower,
sorry, just explain to me why somebody like these mega companies, who obviously can go anywhere they want in the world, why do they go to Ireland with a 12% tax rate when they could go to some of the other tax havens which are much lower, like 10, 8, 6, 5%, like Seychelles or other places?
Well, they do that too. But what companies will do is they'll with their internal accounting, they'll attribute costs to their different offices in different countries, and they'll attribute a high cost in a place where they don't want to earn a profit and a low cost in a place where they do want to earn a profit, to report it, to pay less tax. But Ireland is a place where they can have a head office, say, and employ IT people and customer service people who speak English, where they can't necessarily get a workforce in the Cayman Islands or something like that. There's just not enough people there. So they might report some profits at an even lower company rate in the Cayman Islands, but Ireland is a good compromise where there's a low tax and a workforce.
There are attractions that Australia offers which make us competitive with places that will offer far lower company tax rates. But we aren't so attractive that we can get away with a nearly 30% tax rate on companies.
Exactly. If the tax rate was 20% and we've got nice beaches and we've got a good, well-trained workforce, then a lot of companies will want to set up here.
Right.
And so people say, how do we get manufacturing back to Australia? Well, you get it back by having a lower cost for manufacturing, lower taxes. We can have a lower cost of energy by scrapping renewable energy targets and the net zero and things like that, and just allowing a free market in energy, and deregulating the cost of doing business. So through cutting red tape, so that there's less people's efforts are taken up in sort of compliance work. They say, why is productivity falling? Well, workers aren't getting less productive, but more for every worker that's producing things, more and more workers are tied up with compliance, right? With just doing very seemingly unnecessary paperwork to comply with various rules. If we had less red tape, there'd be less of a drain on business that way. If we had lower energy costs, there's less of a drain that way. If we had lower taxes, we'd attract manufacturing to Australia without the government subsidising anything. It's not like, I will tax you so that we can subsidise this high-cost, unprofitable manufacturer. No, just get the government out of the way again, so that businesses will go where the benefits are highest and the costs are lowest.
Yep. Mark, let's, I guess an hour of economics might be getting to be a bit much for everybody. So let's bring it to an end. If you can summarize for us what we've talked about tonight and put it into just a couple of sentences, the Reader's Digest version of what inflation is, why government shouldn't interfere in prices of mortgage rates and other things, and what the best way is to make sure that the average Australian has the most room for flourishing in the next 5 to 20 years.
Well, that's a big ask. But as I say, inflation...
Just summarize what we've talked about tonight again for us, please.
Yeah. Inflation is not just because a business wanted to put up the price or something. That's just, a silly scare tactic. Inflation is because the money supply was expanded, and it was fun while it was happening for people that owned assets, but people that didn't own assets just missed out. And so inflation is insidious. Inflation is theft, as Dave said right at the start of the show, because by the government creating more money, they create for themselves the means to buy stuff, but they're taking that from other people, from anyone else that owns money. So where the government gets something for nothing, the rest of us that share this world with the government get nothing for something. And so inflation is insidious. It needs to be stamped out. But the only way to stamp out inflation is for the government to stop inflating, that is, stop expanding the money supply. But when they do, there's going to be a reckoning. It's going to mean interest rates rise to something closer to their natural level. When they're at their natural level that balances the interests of savers and borrowers, if it was left like that untouched, we wouldn't have this boom-bust cycle.
Yep.
But since we've had a boom, there's going to be a bust. It's not that someone wants there to be it's not that some scary person told you, vote for me and we'll bust the economy. No. People are telling you, vote for me and everything will be fine, but they're lying, right? There's going to be a reckoning. There has to be. When the government's got something for nothing, other people have to get nothing for something. And we're seeing that now as prices rise, and we'll see it more as interest rates rise, and it's going to be rough. But since there is going to be belt tightening, the people who most ought to tighten their belt are the people who put us into this mess. And that's the Canberra regime. They're the ones who ought to tighten their belts the most. And so we want to reduce the government spending. Something has to reduce, either their spending or yours. Well, it ought to be theirs.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense. Chris Hewitt says, so election promises equals inflation.
Yes.
Look, and I think one of the things I've said for a long time is when voters are motivated by their own hip pocket and the benefits to themselves, that's when we get a predatory government that just makes promises and tells you what you want to hear and puts money in your pocket, pats you on the head and says, vote for me, give me more power. And that's how we have government ever increasing in power and size, because we keep wanting government to give us more, do more for us. We're essentially taking pocket power out of our pockets and putting it into theirs and expecting cash in return. And that's a short-term mirage of hope, because what you're actually getting is the government we've had for the last 2 years, which is far bigger than is good for anybody's health, far more authoritarian and invasive in part of everybody's life. So if you're a freedom voter watching this tonight, stop thinking about your pocket. Stop thinking about a cheap mortgage. Stop thinking about a comfortable life, and start being a bit patriotic. Start having some Christian love for your neighbor and start thinking about what's good for them. And what's good for them is less government, less interference in their wallet, less interference in their health, less interference in where they can invest their superannuation, if they even have to invest it at all, less interference in what they inject in their body, and if they're allowed to go more than 5 kilometers from their house, and if they're allowed to go to church. The interference we've had, this digital privacy bill that the government's proposing right now, utterly ridiculous. Why would you want more government controlling more aspects of your life? And if you believe the sales pitch, I have a bridge in Sydney that's really wonderful that I can sell you. It's just insane. We also have a government bill right now on the table, which is going to punish big tech if they don't censor us enough. Like, are you kidding me? These are the policies which are big government. And that is why we need to be thinking about our nation and our neighbours when we vote, and not just about ourselves. This is economics, it's human behaviour, it's morality. This is super, super important. Chris says that's why I voted for Pauline yesterday. Look, the freedom parties are all good. They definitely need to be put up there. And I had 4 different candidates on last week, one from One Nation, one from LibDems, one from UAP, and one from the Australian Values Party. And honestly, if I was in each of their electorates, I would vote for each of them, because parties and platforms aside, those guys were quality. They really understood the policies their parties were offering. They really understand the bigger issues at play. They're not just random folks that a party grabbed with a shepherd's crook and dumped into the seat. They're actually quality candidates and quality conservatives, genuine small government people. That's what I want to encourage voters to be looking for, not just the parties. Yeah, we're talking about parties and policies and economics and big concept things here tonight. But in your choice, in your electorate, make sure you're looking at the individuals as well as those things. Kesho has a little slogan here, says, society reaps what Schwab sows. So that's a response to freedom over tyranny, saying society reaps what it sows. And you know what? I actually believe what freedom said. Mark, I've been saying for a while that the real solution to fixing Australia isn't changing the seal of the Commonwealth or restoring the 1901 Constitution and expecting the voters in Australia to be suddenly moral and liberty focused instead of authoritarian. What we actually need is a repentance of heart, a humbling of our heart where we actually realize that our culture is totally messed up. And that we ourselves are not the highest authority in the universe, because that's what we've elected. It's politicians who think they're the highest authority in the universe, and they're completely unaccountable to anybody. It's that kind of cultural renewal and revival, which I think is going to make a lasting and a generational change to the nation.
Yeah. And, you know, Jesus said, you know, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them. Their great ones exercise authority over them. Like you've been saying, Dave, that you know, whether it's ScoMo or whether it's Klaus Schwab or whether it's anyone who wants to centrally plan and rule the world, they want to exercise authority, right? They want their top-down plan. But it will not be so with you. Instead, whoever wants to be great among you will be a servant. Right? And also, the Bible says God puts the lonely in families. So something else we need to look out for is each other, right? The family and society and people. Society is you and me and the other person interacting, working together, honest and productive people looking out for one another. And you know, like perfect religion is that you take care of widows and orphans and keep yourself unspotted from the world. That we need to look out for each other, and especially if we are moving into a time where there's going to be economic hardship. Right. And as you've been saying, Dave, you can't look to the people that got us into the mess to get us out of it. So who do we look to? Well, we need to look out for each other, and we need to care for the vulnerable. And that doesn't mean we need to write a letter to Canberra saying you need to care for the vulnerable. It means we need to do it ourselves.
Yes. Yeah, no, 100%. I recorded a video today, wrote and recorded a video in response to that social media post going around, which says, I'm not pro murdering babies. I'm pro Emily, Stephanie, you know, and this other propaganda guff. And there's a couple of items in there where they talk about women who are economically vulnerable and wanting an abortion for social pressure reasons, poverty or high school, etc. And as well as saying there's never a good reason for murdering your baby, including that, I make the point, you know what? Sometimes in fact, too often, we, communities and congregations, do fail these women, and we are the solution. Mm-hmm. Now, those failures notwithstanding, there's still no reason for murdering your children. But in that same acknowledgement, we are the solution. We shouldn't be looking to the government to solve those problems, because not everything should be solved by government. You know, abortion vulnerable women should anticipate support and congratulations from a community that will help them and not leave them alone to struggle. If the question was put, do I let my current kids starve because I've had another one, or do I kill my another one? I mean, that shouldn't be a question any woman should even have to think about, because community and congregations, I mean, let's us Christians take responsibility for this, that no woman would ever think that that was an option in our community. That's certainly something we should, and I don't want to shirk that off to government to solve.
Yeah. I mean, our great-grandparents' generation of like 100 years ago, basically, you know, all of this kind of rot, I mean, you could always pick a date, but it's really been since World War One. And since the 1913, the creation of the Federal Reserve, that's really been the era of big government, of income tax. I mean, before World War One, there was no income tax, and yet people formed friendly societies, and there was still welfare. There was still a social safety net, but it was provided by people in community.
I've had a good conversation with Humphreys about that. It's a good clip I should resurrect and show again. Yeah.
And when the social safety net is provided by real people who you know, then you can't get away with just abusing it, right? Because you're looking at your next door neighbor in the eye and saying, you know, could you help out?
Yep.
And they know who you are, and they know, and you have to be polite, and you have to be a good neighbor yourself, right? And so, as the government has taken over all of these functions, then even, you know, the big charities, sadly, are just now into political lobbying. Rather than how they started out as you know, as grassroots organisations providing actual charity.
Chris Hewitt asks, is it legal to talk someone out of abortion? The short answer is yes. There are exclusion zones around abortion clinics in Queensland and Tasmania and Melbourne and various other states where it's illegal to even pray quietly, silently, by yourself within 50, 100, 150 metres of an abortion clinic. And that is an absolute tyranny and oppression. But it's not like the conversion therapy laws in some states. You certainly should offer support to an abortion vulnerable woman and ask, you know, how you can help and just make them aware of things, or even just show them the video I'm about to release tomorrow, which will do that. Kesho adds, it's harder than asking the government to take your neighbour's car for you. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Kesho. You want to make a guess at that, Mark?
I don't know, but I'm not sure what's harder than asking the government to take your neighbour's car. But
I think you might have been talking about the friendly societies, benevolent societies that you mentioned before, and the face-to-face accountability that those relationships do.
Yeah. Well, if you're just a name on the Centrelink list, there's no mutual obligation there, is there? You can just turn up, and so you're just on the list. If you're literally asking your next door neighbour for charity, and yet you're just honking the horn and revving the engine, and you're asking for charity, but you've got a big V8, and you know what I mean, and you're just a neighbour. Well, maybe they'll say, look, I'm sorry, but I'm helping someone else at the moment. But the neighbour on the other side, who's always been there for other neighbours and has always been a good neighbour and has genuinely fallen on hard times, and when they ask for help, it's sure, I'll help. And so when, or if someone is coming to your church, say, for help, the church will help them. But will the church put them on permanent welfare for the next 20 years?
Generation?
No. Probably they'll say, look, would you be able to just help out? Would you be able to mow the church lawn? Or would you be able to help us deliver these groceries to some old people? Or is there some way that you could help in this charity service rather than just as a recipient? And a genuine person would want to do that, right? a genuine person would say, yeah, I'd love to be involved in the actual delivery of this charity service.
Yep.
And it will help me get work experience and so on. Whereas an obnoxious person who just says, give me the money and shut up, well, anyway, so private charity has a much better feedback loop than government.
And better dignity, I think, as well.
Yeah.
Mark Hornshaw, thank you so much for your time and your insights tonight. Looking forward to a chat with you about education policy that we could be looking at as part of this. It's probably not the most pressing issue in this federal election, but it is a pressing issue. Freedom is right up there. But you know what? With the government indoctrination centres that used to be called schools, the woke activism that goes on in those places, we need to be looking with fresh eyes at how we can reinvent education policy in Australia. So let's have another chat about that in the next 2 weeks before people cast their vote. I do encourage you, put your vote off as long as possible, people, because you need as much information as possible, even if it's just to decide whether you go 1-2-3 or 2-3-1 or 1-3-2 in those freedom parties at the top of your ballot. But you know what, there's policy announcements and other things that will happen in the next 2 weeks. Just put off your vote as long as you can. Early voting should only be used for people who really can't vote on polling day. So some opinions go. More information is helpful. Mark, thank you so much for your time tonight. Where can people find more from your thinking and information?
Well, if you're interested in the Liberal Democrats, and we've had our policies out since last year, no shock announcements on election day, no handouts, no bribes from us. We've had our Freedom Manifesto out since like about October or something. So you can just go to ldp.org.au, and you can find our Freedom Manifesto there. If you're a voter in Lyne, then
That's on the mid-north coast of New South Wales?
North coast of New South Wales, then I'd gladly accept your number one vote. That would be great. If you want to see some other articles by me, I've written a few things at the Foundation for Economic Education, fee.org. If you look up my name there at fee.org, you'll see some things by me. Or you could just get in touch by email. Dave, could I put my email address somehow on the show notes or something like that?
Yeah, just or let me do it now. I'll put it on the screen.
Mark.Hornshaw.
Yep. At
ldp.org.au.
Okay, we'll put that on right now because there's a few different places for you to put it as a comment later. There it is on the screen right now. mark.hornshaw@ldp.org.au, said out loud for the benefit of those people on the podcast. Can I get you to maybe think about contributing a podcast or two to the Good Source platform in weeks and months to come?
You could talk me into it. Yeah, I'll chat with you about some ideas. But certainly about education and home education, a lot of people during the lockdown especially and especially those who didn't want their kids to be vaxxed, and there was palpable fear that the vax bus was just going to turn up and do it without the parents' knowledge. And so a lot of people at that time were becoming overnight home educators.
Yep.
And saying, what do we do? And finding out that it's not quite as simple as they thought.
Yep.
People wanting to start micro schools or home education co-ops, and also teachers who'd been sacked, thinking this might be an opportunity for me to find re-employment. We're also finding that the regulation around schools just made that almost impossible.
Wow.
So, I'd love to have that chat as well.
Brilliant. Okay, we'll do that, make that happen. Mark Hornshaw, thank you very much tonight.
Thanks so much, Dave. It's been great fun.
That's Mark Hornshaw, economics lecturer at the University of Notre Dame, and somebody who's correcting the misinformation of, voters around Australia now as well. He's also a candidate and one of the policy writers for the Liberal Democrat Party. Now, if you would like to support the Good Source, please head to goodsource.news click on the button that says support, or just add /support after the URL, goodsource.news/support. We can put that on the screen too, I'm pretty sure, or you can go to davepello.com and become a supporter there. That's it for this evening. Don't forget, there is this video coming out tomorrow to deal with the really disgusting propaganda that has come out from some other person that's been shared like 100,000 times or more on Facebook, to do with somebody claiming that they're not pro-murdering babies, but then she goes ahead and outlines about 10 to 20 different scenarios where it's totally fine to murder a baby. So I don't even know how she can lie straight in bed with dishonesty like that. But that's coming out tomorrow. Make sure you subscribe to my personal Facebook page, Dave Pello, and my YouTube channel as well. We'll put it there, and I'll probably put it on the Good Source website as well. This is really important information to get out there, because I just don't know how anybody can be pro-abortion in this day and age. You're either anti-science or you're a radical sociopath. And I don't think there's any other explanation for a person who justifies the killing of living humans. It's worse than slavery. Anyway, that's it. If you don't like the fact that I'm anti-abortion, suck it up, go elsewhere. Don't really care. That's me. Take it or leave it. That's the end of Pello Talk tonight, and I hope that you enjoyed it, you were challenged by it, equipped and built up by it. Thank you for watching, and good night.
Today, we need a special kind of courage. Not the kind needed in battle, but a kind which makes us stand up for everything that we know is right, everything that is true and honest. We need the kind of courage that can withstand the subtle corruption of the cynics, so that we can show the world that we are not afraid of the future.